All right. Yeah. Welcome back, James. Yeah.
Thank you
Uh,
for having me again, Wim.
yeah. Great to have you. It's been a week or yeah, I think last week we did a session last week on project communication, client communication, and you can lose or win a client there or another referral and how we communicate. We can do great tech work, as you mentioned, and be building amazing networks or whatever it might be. But if the client's not feeling the love, then um, they may pay the invoice, but begrudgingly, and we may not get more. So it's all about how we make them feel through that, the expectations and feeling good, valued, in touch, and not over communicating, not under communicating, all those things. So that was great. And yeah, what should we get into this time?
We sort of brought it up last week around managing out of scope and mentioned it along with the communication point with clients. And what you just said there around communication is one of our make or break points with projects. And as we discussed in our last session, a lot of us don't really do it very well. And much the same as our out of scope processes. Often we don't even have an out of scope process because we're not really managing our scopes and creating scopes in the first place during the sales process. We've spoken about that in a previous session as well for people who are just joining us for the first time.
Yep.
But really today, I think we can talk about that. We're in the middle of delivering a project and things are changing and we're using more hours, we're things that are not happening as planned, and how do we need to manage that both on a customer expectation side internally, how we're managing that, and then how is it going to affect billing? What's the most important part of the projects? If we're doing this once-off self-contained work, we should be managing our margins and that we're actually being profitable in what we're delivering. Because otherwise, why have we even bothered spending all this time to deliver it?
Yeah.
So I think where to start is you need a scope. You can't manage an out of scope process without having some kind of scope. And like we've discussed before, scopes don't need to be deep detailed. It helps, but even if we're starting to build out our processes and our thoughts, we don't need a full 100-page scope to manage a simple project. We need to know what are the outcomes that we're trying to get and what are the key things that we're delivering as a part of that project, and then the clear things that are out of scope at that point.
Yep.
And this is all handled in our sales process. And I think more than anything, outside of being aware of that and setting the tone in our proposals and actually having it written down, is that managing the expectation of the client in the conversations. Where I think in general we're very fast to get excited because we've got a potential sale, there's some potential big cash involved, so we're trying to skip the sales process as fast as we can so that we can get into delivery. And I think that's where we start missing some of those important parts around the expectation setting.
Yeah.
Especially when a client is coming to us and saying, we need a project, we need to do this, how can you help us? We jump straight to the technical side and don't talk about the billing, what's in and out of scope, what happens if it's out of scope. What's your experience on that? Have you succeeded in making that sales expectation work, or what are some of the mistakes you've
I've
made?
learned the hard way on that. So in my MSPs, it's just that being too loose on that scope of work. Because in our mind, I've done all the scoping. I think this will take that much work and so much. I put it there. It's going to be whatever, 10 grand. Here's what we're going to do. But it wasn't clear when it comes down to doing the work. The technicians aren't clear on what it is. So it might be clear in my head, and the client has their expectation, which is probably not exactly the same, but the techs don't really know. And then just the way it's set up in the PSA, they just enter the time. They want to make the client happy and make it amazing, but they lose track of what's in scope and what's out. So that's, the process is not there, the SOP, that they shouldn't feel stressed to say, hey, this is out of scope. It should be a natural thing to bring that up to the client and get approval and inform them. I've lost so much profit by not managing it. And even I've lost clients on that. So that's why it's become important to me, and that's why we're talking about it. And designing the flow and the tickets, and that's to do that. I can just see we got those problems. Like we're deciding, or we're dealing with it at the end. So we want to close out the project and be done. Even if it was, and then we say, oh man, we went over here and there, and we think it's out of scope. But it's like, do we bill it or not? It's kind of gray. Do we bill it, and the client's can be kind of upset, and they might still pay it, or do we want to fight it, or do we want to just suck it up and move on? And that's, really hard. I think the worst example I had is we had a project that was supposed to be, I figured, around 200 hours. When we were all said and done, it was like 800. That almost killed my business. So impacted other clients. So managing the scope and the billing for is really key. And that starts day one. Well, as you mentioned, it starts in the sales process. Being really clear. And so my approach has been, again, it doesn't need to be pages and pages. It could just be part of the 10 bullet points. But here's the 5 to 10 things we're doing that's included. And then be really clear on what we're excluding. And then the last bullet is we're excluding everything else that's not included. So it's just getting it twice. So on a network, if we're rebuilding a network, we're not pulling network runs, we're not terminating runs. We're assuming all your wiring is in place and good. Because we don't do that. But if we don't spell it out and we're saying we're giving you a new network or a network upgrade, they're going to assume we're going to fix bad runs and pull more runs. Not the case. So
that's the best terminology for it. It's the things that aren't being excluded, unless you know the really specifics. It's listing the assumptions of what the scope is based off, so that you can turn around, and even if we haven't really delineated the real exclusions, we can turn around and say, well, we've made the assumption based on what our best knowledge, you would have the network connections in place for when we showed up. We're moving, we're doing a 365 migration from on-prem to up to the cloud. We're assuming your hardware is going to be capable enough of when we're doing the migration that it's not going to fall over and die. It's really a lot of those big picture items. It's also a lot of those little repeatable things for the types of projects we're doing as well. A good one that I learned that burnt us quite early on when we were doing Office 365 migrations way back in the day when it first became a thing was that none of the tools or anything were capable of migrating task colors. And the amount of people that were so fixated on their task colors that they'd set up in Outlook, the amounts of issues that it created were ridiculous back in the day. And we learnt from the first two. We made the first mistake, we weren't aware of it. Second one, we didn't worry about it and then ended up in the same position. But we learnt from that and added those sort of assumptions or those sort of points that we'd make sure were written in the proposal. And when we're doing the sales, we're actually communicating to clients to set their expectation of simply saying, your task colors aren't going to come with it. And it's always the small things a lot of the time that are the issue with the client from my experience. It's not big things that are fairly self-explanatory, like your example for the network. They might not be aware of it, but when you bring it up and say, well, actually we told you to get an electrician or you need an electrician to do this sort of thing, they get it. It's when it's usually the smaller, finer details that are actually impacting their day-to-day work that become the major issues.
Yeah.
So that scope conversation in the first place with the client and setting those expectations, super important to allow us to flow through. But I also think the billing implications we don't talk enough about when we are doing the sales expectation. Because again, we're trying to skip the steps, and it's not from maliciousness or us trying to be dodgy IT people. We're just excited to get to the work because that's what we're good at. That's what we enjoy. We enjoy the technology. But we really need to slow down and make sure the client understands what's going to happen when it falls out of scope and what's our process and how are they going to be billed for it. And that's typically, even if we know what our sort of scope is, like what you mentioned earlier around, we're often leaving all of these conversations till when the project's done, and then we've got this awkwardness of, well, we've got 600 hours to bill now. What are we going to do with that? we tend to just suck it up and ignore it because it's easier than having the conflict. So us having the conversation earlier and making sure that billing will happen, and there's several mechanisms. If we're selling a fixed price project, you might sell if there's an out of scope, we might quote it up and give them a fixed price to do the out of scope. And we might follow the same process if we're already taking 100% prepayment. Well, we'll take 100% prepayment before we do the new scope work. You might be billing by the hour and gave them an estimate. So you might do the same thing in the scope. And by setting that expectation in the conversation and then setting it in the proposal, it shouldn't be a big deal to talk about money past that point. If something's out of scope, it's out of scope. And we just go through that approval process that we'll talk to in a minute. But it shouldn't be a big thing. It should just sort of flow with our general project flow at that point.
Yeah.
What's the typical mechanisms you look at when you're looking at billing out of scope work?
Well, a lot of what we do is retainers, so we do some fixed price as well. But even with if we're doing a fixed price project, an onboarding or migration, whatever it might be, we still have retainers. So it's just we put that right into proposal. Out of scope work will be X dollars an hour, build on your retainer. So to get an approval, but yeah, they'd have money in our bank account already that we just take it out of. So we're not out of pocket, but just we'd bill them another block and just part of a retainer block management process. But we would make sure in our project that it's want it to be easy. So we have a phase typically for out of scope stuff, extras, issues, whatever. Again, the issues might be in the project, so it's not about whether it's an issue or not, but having a phase that bills separately. That's very clear. And so the technicians don't have to worry about what agreement or parameters. As long as the ticket's in that phase, then everything else will flow through, gets invoiced separately, and it's all fine. So that's working pretty good now for us.
We used to charge full fixed price when I was managing our MSP. So we'd quote a full fixed price project, take 100% prepayment. And because we wouldn't do a standalone project without them engaged as a client. So this is where you often have issues is when people get you to do a project, they say it's a test. Once you do that, we'll sign up to your managed services. How many times have you heard that in your time, Wim?
Oh,
and then
yeah,
they don't follow up. But we found because we had existing clients, all we did was make it quite simple. We've already taken the prepayment. Unless it's going to be over a certain size, we would just bill them by the hour in arrears after it. So we'd communicate, and that was and we did the same thing as what you said, is have that separately billed phase, so it was nice and clear that these were out of scope, and this is why I was billing for it. I think there's a danger in general because most people aren't doing what either of the mechanisms that we spoke about. They're not doing it as a fixed price project, and they're not taking a retainer and getting the cash up front. Most people are taking the down payment for hardware, and that's it. And then they'll bill everything in arrear. So I think there's a huge danger that I see with that mechanism is all we're doing is adding to this bill, and coming to the end again. And then what happens if a client says, well, I don't want to pay for that component, the project's not fixed, not complete, et cetera. Like you're holding the bag for this whole thing. And it's very easy, even if you've got good scope and good scope control and a good out of scope process, even if they've approved it and things, it gets very difficult when they say, well, the project's not finished, when they've been adding all these out of scope works, and you're holding all that balance for the cash.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess
so.
we don't have a ton that goes out of scope, so it hasn't been a huge thing. Obviously, we had the big issue like 7 years ago that 600 hours over budget, but just one now. We did a recent a phone system migration, VoIP migration 3 months ago, and there were issues because we used a new SIP trunk provider and a new hosting provider, and there was dropped calls. So now it's like, we sent a So that was flat fee project. So we did a lot of extra work to make it work. It's a bit of a risk on our part, so we can't bill for that because we changed two things at once. So the end result was good. But yeah, the scope was different because it ends up the call volume was through the roof. They had 4 lines before, and like, okay, if we move them to 8 lines, because they had busy signals, so upgrade their line should be fine. But it's a medical office, and they had so many calls that it was still slammed, even like they got hundreds of calls, so even 8 lines were full. So yeah, just troubleshooting that was a lot. So we couldn't bill it. But now I see some of the time actually was put on a service ticket, and it should have been moved into the project, so we have a better overview of our profitability on it. But yeah, we billed some of it, and the client's like, oh, now you used up my retainer. Like, where did it all go? Like, you guys said you would help us, you would guarantee the work. So we had to go through each time entry and like, okay, we shouldn't have billed this one, but this is actually a legitimate change out of scope. So we should have caught that early on. When the ticket was created, it should have been I decided then really triage. So I would say, so looking back, just thinking about that project, and those are conversation going on this week, and we could have triaged that better to get it out of a service ticket into the project as an issue in ConnectWise. And I don't know what the Autotask equivalent is, but there must be something there as well.
That's a very good point about the mechanisms of identifying project issues or project scope creep. Is nearly all of these come through the help desk. There's probably 3 ways that we end up having a change to scope. 4 ways, I should say. The first one is what you just highlighted. There's an issue, it's reported to help desk, and then all of a sudden the help desk are working on it. So we've spoken about before around like using notifications in our PSA and our documentation to say that it's a project going on. Maybe we should look at if it's a project issue before we start it. That helps with that. The other one's usually when a tech's working on something and they feel like they need to do something. They need to do something else as a part of the project. So that's usually our danger one. That's where lots and lots of hours get burnt because they'll be working on a server. They'll be putting up a VM and they realize the other VM's not quite right, so they will feel like they need to fix that as a part of the project, whether legitimate or not. But we're not having that conversation of if we should do it or not. The third one is we've got a specific methodology that we're working to, and the tech starts working with it, and it's not going to plan for whatever reason. Maybe it's you're doing a migration to the cloud, and the internet connection's not good enough, or the server hardware is starting to fail, things like that. Or the fourth one is then the client requesting, well, I don't want it red, I actually want it blue. Those kinds of things that they start requesting that may be legitimate or maybe pushing the scope and scope creep. So understanding the points of where they come in, then you can manage then the process. Because I think most people, when they start thinking about out of scope and an approval process, the approval process is fairly simple. They haven't taken into account how do things get identified and how is it managed so someone can actually then make the decision. Because it's too grey otherwise. So if you know how they're coming in, then we can talk about the mechanisms of managing that scope approval. And from my experience, because most of the time it's owner-led sales, and it's like we've spoken about this a few times through the series, the owner, and you said it today, like you can have an idea of how all of this work is working in your head, and you're the one that has directly sold it to the client. It's not so easy for the project team to make the decisions, and they always have to keep coming back to you. And that's one of the first things to work out in the process. What is the approval to identify whether it is or isn't out of scope, even if we don't have a scope, or even if we do have the scope? Who's actually the end decision maker of is this in scope or not? Who's responsible for making that call?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, is it the salesperson who may not know the technology? Is it the lead technician, or is it a project manager? You can't leave it to chance. That should be clear and explicit. But yeah, I see that a lot. That technician is helping with one issue, and the client asks about this and that, and it makes some changes and improvements as they go along. So there's like no change management, not separate tickets. It's just time that's getting entered, and it's really hard to distinguish it later when it comes to billing it. So that's why I'm just a very structured kind of thinker. That's just who I am, and I like to see separate tickets and structured and notes and next steps and all of that. But I know there's some technicians are just they're high in that influence and they're extroverted, and just make the client feel happy. And the client is happy because it's getting solved and improved, but it was out of scope. Or they're covering ground that we already did in the sales process. We decided it would be a phase 2, and it still ends up in phase 1 because the tech is now just jumping into it. So it's sometimes we've got to slow the customer down and say, yes, it would be nice to add this bell and whistle right here, but let's finish this current scope before we get into the next one. Add it on the backlog on the wish list, and then let's close this, and then we'll go and create a new project or a phase for that next part.
That's how projects turn from 200 hours to 800 hours, isn't it?
There's a lot of stories with that. But yeah, I don't want to go too much into that. It just gets kind of painful. But it's like,
no, but I think every MSP has had that sort of experience, haven't they? I think that, and it's the perfect storm that usually ends up, and there always are big stories with it. And I think I go back to what we were just talking about with the roles and responsibilities there. I don't ever think technical people are the right people to make the decision on scope or not. They need to be trained on how to identify that things aren't in scope, and then what our process is for actually going through the approval process. They can contribute to what the solution is, very much leverage them. It's very hard to be the person delivering it and making those decisions outside of like personality and anything like that. It's the same as when we've got an emergency ticket that comes through the service desk. You can't be the same person trying to fix the issue and communicate with the clients. Even if you're very capable of that, it's not a very productive way of doing it. It's always much better to have a second party there to question it and get the information and answers out so that they can actually decide, is it in scope or is it out of scope, and then can communicate it with the client. And I think typically in a organization that it's still owner-led sales, we don't have a lot of team separation. A lot of it should come onto the owner because they're the one that's sold it, and they've got to see all the issues that have come out of it. And not just because like they're in charge and they should make the decisions, but if you're aware of this, then you can start improving the front end sales processes as well as helping them fix the project, because you're overseeing the whole process, even if you're not involved in all the little details. But that annoyance of them coming to you should be a good incentive to actually set up better, well-defined processes.
Yep.
When you're a bit more well-defined and you have a few more resources in play, typically the project manager should be making these decisions and be empowered to do it. They might have to rely on engaging with the account management to smooth things over if they're the ones that have sold it, but generally it should be empowered that the project manager is making that call if it's not out of scope, and are we billing or are we going to suck it up because we missed it? It should have been something simple that we scoped, and we'll just cop it as a learning lesson. There needs to be someone that's really holding the bag. The ones that are responsible for the profitability should be the ones making the decisions, because they should be driven by the financial aspects, which, as we're talking through this is why we do out of scope management in the first place, is we're managing for financially. If the financials didn't matter, it wouldn't matter how long we took to do things. We'd just give all our labor away for free just to get the outcome for the client. But that's not what we're trying to achieve from our projects.
Yeah.
I think once we can identify it, then and decide whether it's in or out of scope, then we go back to the billing mechanisms. If like your example of a retainer, we probably just need to let the client know that we're billing out of scope work. My one was the same. We just let them know, and they'll just get billed at the end, and they sort of had a chance to say no at that point, and if they say no, that's fine, we won't do it. If they said yes, we're billing for it. But I think a lot more, as we're getting mature as an industry, I think there needs to be a lot more of sign off, and especially if you're trying to charge fixed fee or trying to estimate, we should go back through the sales process and actually get a proper sign off and come through the system the same way and same processes. Because if we don't have it in writing properly, again, we're going to make the mistake of not having it properly scoped out. So the irony of having out of scope work that's not scoped, creating more out of scope work. Like we've all been there.
Yeah.
But having actually the client to sign off on the scope has changed, they're approving it, this is how much money we're expecting to pay. That formality, I think, is becoming more and more important as we're going down the road of having more insurance risks as well. That's
a good point.
Age.
Yeah. Rather than kind of informally deciding, okay, we don't need to do this level of security permission or setting policy in the firewall, whatever it might be. That should be documented and signed off. This was the best practice. This is what insurance requires, and you've waived it. Yeah.
Especially if they're not your existing client base. And go back to that example of we've got a prospect that we can do a project for. If we're not very formal with them, that can come bite you years later because you touched it last. You set this up for me, and now I got breached.
Yeah,
there's a lot of big risks.
Very little of that, just for those reasons. Like, I'm okay with like a get in the door strategy, but I think there should be some level of recurring revenue, some ongoing relationship. Doesn't need to be $5,000 a month. Like maybe we get started with something that's $1,000 a month, and then we look at as we make more improvements, we increase that monthly. But yeah, just to go and do like a service setup and not manage it long term, that's kind of risky unless you're really clear on that scope and expectations. Like we did something recently where we helped this university set up a 365 tenancy for one of their projects and hand it off to them. That's part of it. So that's okay because they've got a team to manage it. But yeah, I agree. There's just too many times I've done free audits or even a paid audit and it doesn't convert to a monthly agreement. So now it's all, we got to sell them on the long-term relationship from the beginning, even if they start with the network assessment, but it's got to be in mind of we're going to go to the next step, which is onboarding. All right, so that's right now we're in a good spot, and we do the get me out of trouble process. We've got a flat fee process. For let's take Linux server, get me out of trouble. They got a broken hard drive or video card or whatever, server down, flat fee, $1,000, go fix it, and then from there might go into a discovery project, which is a block of time. 15 to 30 hours. And from that, there's recommendations and a roadmap. And we go into onboarding, which is flat fee. So your setup fee is 2 times the monthly recurring revenue, plus any customizations. So that onboarding is flat fee for that standard scope of work, monitoring, backups, documentation. Perhaps there's some standing up of servers with a standard way, but moving your application, moving the data, like moving in, it's like buying a house. Hey, that's flat fee, but moving in and customizing it in some renos to take out a wall, tweak it for you, we'll do retainer. And it's been working really well. Clients are clear, our techs are clear. It's the same way across the board. The model's right on the website even. We're very transparent on how we bill.
So, I think it's important. I think we did the same. We back when I was managing MSP, we made the mistakes of getting caught up with these potential prospects. Oh, can you do us a new server and then we'll come on board? And surprise, surprise, they never did back in the day. But as we transition and we're delivering different kinds of services and people are becoming a lot more cloud and SaaS orientated, there's going to be a lot of professional services work out there. There's a lot of opportunity to do these once-off projects. Like your example with the 365 with the university. Be a lot more organizations looking for that kind of thing. And this is where that scope becomes a lot more important because it is we should, if we're doing these once-off things, we need to have very clear what we're doing, what we don't do, and the fact that we aren't providing ongoing support past there, because purely because of these insurance risks. And I think that even extends into the onboarding to clients. The onboarding to clients, we're all very focused on full all-you-can-eat services. That's going to change as well. I think the more detached people come from on-site infrastructure, the game changes again while we all develop our more niche solutions that we're providing to clients. More clients are going to want hybrid models to onboard. So we used to, what you were talking about with the client onboarding, it would be very rare that we'd onboard someone straight to all you can eat. We would do a hybrid model of, we'll provide all the proactive and management pieces at a recurring fixed price, and then all the support was billed by the hour, because we didn't know what environments we were walking into. What we did, we knew they weren't very well set up. There was a reason they were coming to us, because they had lots of problems. So we were managing our risk in this, and this is what Scope's all about. And I think what you were just saying about the phases around like the onboarding of someone as well, and how much you charge. Like, I think charging for onboarding is really important. We shouldn't be giving away all that work.
Oh no.
Generally, our scoping for new client onboardings, again, because we're super excited about getting a new client, we don't really scope it up and have those phases built out. So we rush in, and we should all know by now, if we're onboarding a new client, we've got to do those phases like you were talking about around like discovery. We need to actually know what the environment is. But even if we're doing that, we usually give away all this work to fix things up inside the onboarding project. We'll tie in, I often see people tying in fixing major issues basically for free inside this setup process.
Yeah, we split that. There's the onboarding, and then there's stabilization, and really call it stabilization or migration, whatever it is, but distinguish it. Yeah.
And it's so important to scope that journey out from that perspective, because again, our poor techs on the front line that are getting given this project, like, what are they to do? They're just trying to make the client happy, and especially with a new client, we're pushing the pressure on this as a new client. We need to be on our best behavior. We need to show how much value we're creating for them. What are they going to do? They're going to rush in and do absolutely everything possible to make the environment great and show how good we are as a business. But how can they manage that?
Yeah. Okay. So just I guess real quick on tools. We talked about leveraging the PSA, so learning the project management, the finance side of it, making sure it posts properly to your GL, all those things, templates, making sure everybody in the team is aware of how those things work. When we transit or kick off the project, that they're familiar with the scope, where to find it. It's in the tickets, easy to find. They shouldn't have to go to, let's say, the quoting platform and find the PDF, but it should be right at their fingertips, easy to find. So there's that. We have dashboards set up, so we use Grafana for that. Pulls into ConnectWise, the SQL queries to look at the project health performance. So the team leads and product managers can look at that every day. How are we doing on the finance, the profitability of the project? Are we green, orange, red? So that's been helpful, because we don't want to know 30 days later. It's like, we got to know today, this week, because they could put in 50 hours this week, and it goes from we haven't done anything to now we're over budget in a week or 3 days even. If you get 3 guys working on some issue for a day, you got to know your numbers. So is there any other tools you've looked at or heard about that can help MSPs with scoping?
Well, the scoping part, ScopeStack is something that I'm seeing coming across a lot more to create the consistency that plugs into PSAs and the quoting tools, which can help quite a lot of people create that sort of framework of what a scope should be. We've spoken before, like even using Excel and actually putting the time in and can get the results. But having some form of tool to create the scope is quite important. And I think what you said about the dashboards is also important. I see many people with like Bright Gauge that have lots and lots of service metric numbers than have very, very few, if anything at all, with projects. So starting there and getting some numbers is really useful. And I think even from everything we discussed today, if you're able to just oversee the amount of hours going to each project and keeping an eye on that more frequently at its base level, you can manage a lot of this out of scope stuff. Because if you know that, all right, we're starting to creep up in the hours, I'll go find out why. All right, I feel like we're spending too much time. The client's requesting some stuff. I better go have a conversation with the client and say we're going to bill more because we're using more time up.
Yeah.
That on its simplicity will achieve what we've been talking about today. But obviously that can be a lot of work, but it's a starting point. And building out all the little things that we've spoken about today will take it away from that awkward conversation of the muscle and feel of, oh, we're just spending too much hours. We can look at all these components around how are we selling it in the first place and our financing. Yep. And then all these approval methods through so that we don't have to just have constant conversation going with the client to say, we're charging you more, I know we estimated X, Y, Z, we're billing you by the hour, we're just going to bill you for that.
Yeah.
It makes it a lot less awkward, but more important, empowers you to empower your team to take on a lot of these functions and make sure it flows, and they can have the conversations when it's needed to resolve a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I guess obviously the other one on tools, as TopLeft, we have dashboards for that as well with the Kanban view. So as you can have service-specific ones and then the project-specific ones. So really zoom out of the work to the bigger picture of how is the entire portfolio doing, whether it's 5 projects or 50 or 100 is how are the individual projects doing, and then tap into them and see how are the phases doing, the individual tickets, are they flowing along, anything neglected, anything over budget at those various levels. So that's a bit of a game changer for many MSPs, just getting into that, customizing it for how they work, set up her flow, visibility, and not having to click around and run all these reports and dump to Excel and cut and paste and filter. It's right in front of you because we're visual kind of people, so we all are. So yeah, that's the other one. Okay, I'm trying to think how to sum this up, but the big thing is starting early and having a process and no surprises, no drama, like with some of the other things. This is all communication, as we touched on in the previous video. But yeah, having a process for it, creating maturity.
I think owning it is the first. Being aware that it's actually a problem. Everyone knows that scoping is an issue and out of scope management is an issue. It's not a surprise when we talk about this. But actually owning this and resolving it is the only way it's going to change. And just knowing these components and taking a step-by-step approach. Again, it's not all or nothing. Don't think you need to have it all rolled out, all 100% perfect, all this rigmarole around it. Take little bite-sized chunks of finding where the issues are for you, and just keep improving each time, one step at a time. Is what's going to make a difference, and learn your lessons. Don't make the same mistakes twice, and you'll be better off.
Yeah, continuous improvement. A little bit better every day, 1% every day, and in a year, that's a good 200, 300%. So good. Well, we'll wrap it up there, and we'll talk next week about lots more projects to go through yet. So that's been good. Thank you. So yeah, this was I'm Wim Kerkhoff, founder of TopLeft and 2 MSPs here in Canada, and James Davis is with C-Level Operations APAC. So
thanks for having me again, Wim. Hopefully everyone's got a bit of nugget to go back and start doing those 1%ers.
Yep. All right.